So tree diagrams are a really nice visual way of seeing probability and your outcomes, and they're really handy to use in certain probability problems because you can multiply along the branches and add down the leaves, and it makes it really easy to calculate your probability. So in this first example, we have the counters in a bag, and we're picking a red or a green counter, and we're picking two counters at a time. So what we need to do when we start with our tree diagram is we start at a single point, and from that point we have our options. Now in this case there are just two options, but you could have more than two options. You could have three options. You could say like be playing a game of football and you could have win, lose or draw, or you could have more than two colours in your bag. You could have red, green, black, yellow. So you can put as many branches as you need to for the different options that you have. But in this case, we have either red or we have green. And this first set of branches represents our first choice. So when we pick our first counter out of the bag, we can only pick one counter. So we can either pick a green one or we can pick a red one. We can't pick a red and a green because we're only picking out one counter. So we pop that counter back into the bag again and we pick out a second counter. So again, we have two options. And the reason why we have now two sets of branches is because we have two different options. So we could have picked out a red counter and then whatever we pick out next. Or we have option 2 where we picked out a green counter and then we pick out whatever we pick out next. So we have the two different branches with the two different options of what we first picked out of the bag when we picked out our first counter. So again, we can pick out a red counter or we can pick out a green counter. And if we picked out a green counter first, when we pick out a second, again, we can pick out a red counter or we can pick out a green counter. So those are our options. Now to work out what the outcomes were, if we wanted to list them, say if the question said list the outcomes from picking two counters out of a bag, all we now need to do is go along the branches. So the first branch is red and red, so that would be my first outcome. The second one would be red on the first branch and then green on the second. And then my third option is picking out a green counter first and then picking out a red counter. And then my final option is picking out a green counter first and then a green counter second. So you can see really clearly by following the branches what my outcomes would be. So by picking out two counters from a bag, I have 4 different possible outcomes, and then that will help later when I'm calculating the probabilities.